I recently lived through my own worst nightmare. The HOA president bulldozed my family's 1924 stone bridge while I was still jogging across with my morning coffee with my dog. Her excuse? Historic eyesores clash with my $4 million resort. Funny thing is, the only thing she wrecked was my patience, because I had a secret that could ruin her precious resort. Let me start from the beginning. The first sound was a deep, guttural growl that wasn't human. It came from my German shepherd, Kaiser. His body was low to the ground, every muscle tight as a piano wire. The second sound was a crack, sharp and loud, like a giant snapping a bone. I dropped my coffee mug on the porch. It shattered, the dark liquid spreading like blood on the gray-painted wood. My wife, Clara, was at my side in a second, her hand on my arm. Her touch was meant to be calming, but I was already moving, my bare feet pounding across the damp morning grass. Kaiser was a blackened tin blur ahead of me, his barks echoing through our quiet lakeside neighborhood. I rounded the bend in our street, and my world stopped. A massive yellow bulldozer, ugly and brutal, was parked where the old stone bridge should have been or where part of it should have been. The machine's giant metal claw was raised high, and at its feet was a pile of rubble. The beautiful, hand-laid stones my great-grandfather had set almost 100 years ago were now just a heap of broken rocks and dust. And standing there, next to this monster of a machine, was the devil herself. Brenda Montgomery, president of our homeowners association, had a smile on her face. It was a thin, tight smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. She held a clipboard like a royal scepter, her designer pantsuit ridiculously out of place against the backdrop of destruction. Her daughter, Tiffany, a miniature, even more entitled version of her mother, stood beside her, filming the whole thing on her phone with a bored expression. "Morning, Ethan," Brenda chirped, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Big changes happening on Captain Avenue. Progress." Kaiser was going ballistic, barking and snarling at the bulldozer driver, a big, beefy guy who just stared straight ahead, ignoring us. I pointed a shaking finger at the pile of rocks. "What is this? What have you done?" My voice was low, a dangerous rumble I hadn't used since my days in the army. It was the voice that came out right before things got bad. Clara came up behind me, her presence a silent warning to keep my head. Brenda just laughed, a short, sharp bark that had no humor in it. "It's called an improvement, Ethan. That old, crumbling bridge was an eyesore. A liability. We're clearing the way for the new resort entrance. It's all approved." She waved a piece of paper from her clipboard. A permit. I knew without even looking at it that it was bogus, a piece of paper she'd pushed through with threats and lies, just like she did everything. "My great-grandfather built that bridge," I said, my fists clenching at my sides, with his own hands. "It was a landmark. It was a pile of old rocks." Tiffany sneered, not even looking up from her phone. "It was ugly. The new resort is going to be, like, so much better." I took a step forward, a dangerous step. The bulldozer driver shifted in his seat, his hand moving toward a heavy wrench. Clara's grip tightened on my arm. "Ethan, don't," she whispered. Her voice was calm, but I could feel the steel in it. She was right. A fistfight on the street wasn't the way. That was the old me, the hot-headed me. But seeing that bridge, my family's legacy, turn into gravel for her ugly resort, it was bringing that part of me back with a vengeance. "This isn't over, Brenda," I said, my voice flat and cold. I looked her right in the eye, letting her see the promise there. I wasn't just some angry homeowner she could bully into submission. She had made a mistake. She had underestimated me. She had made it personal. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. She saw it. She saw the real me. But then the mask was back in place. "Oh, I think it is," she said, her voice dripping with poison. "The bridge is gone. The resort is coming, and there is nothing you can do about it." She then turned her gaze to my house, 100 yards away. Her eyes narrowed on my mailbox, a simple black one that met all postal regulations but wasn't the specific, ridiculously expensive model she had mandated last month. "By the way," she said, tapping her pen on the clipboard, "you're getting another fine. That mailbox is a violation. $25 a day until it's fixed." She turned and gestured for the bulldozer to start its engine again. The machine roared to life, its diesel fumes filling the air. It was a final insult, a petty show of power designed to tell me I was nothing. She thought she had won. She thought she had all the power. She was wrong. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She had started a war she couldn't possibly win because she didn't even know the weapons I had at my disposal. As the bulldozer lowered its claw to smash another piece of my family's history, I called Kaiser to my side. He came instantly, pressing against my leg, still growling low in his chest. I put my hand on his head, and Clara put her hand on my back. We stood there, the three of us, a united front against the destruction. Brenda thought she was just tearing down an old stone bridge. What she was really doing was waking a sleeping giant. And as I watched her walk away, smug and victorious, I knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. She had just signed her own eviction notice, and I was going to be the one to deliver it. The only question was how much of her world I would have to burn to the ground before she was gone for good. We moved to Lake Norwood for peace. That's the funny part. After years in the military, seeing things no one should ever have to see, all I wanted was quiet. A little house, a big yard for my dog, and a calm lake to look at every morning. Clara wanted the same. We found this place, a small community tucked away in the hills, built around a sparkling blue lake. It felt like paradise. The houses were spaced out. The air was clean. And at the entrance to our little street, Ton Avenue, was the coal bridge. It wasn't big or fancy. It was a simple, elegant arch made of local stone, built in 1924 by my great-grandfather, Elijah Cole. He finished the dam in 23, then capped it with the coal bridge the following spring. He was one of the first people to settle here. He built his cabin. Then he built that bridge so his neighbors could get across the creek that fed the lake. It was a piece of my family, a piece of this town's soul. For the first year, it was perfect. We fixed up the house. I built a workshop in the garage. Clara planted a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. Kaiser had acres of woods to run in. Life was good. Simple. Then Brenda Montgomery was elected president of the Homeowners Association. It started small. That's how tyrants always start. A new rule about trash can placement. You couldn't see them from the street. Fine. Annoying, but fine. Then it was a specific type of trash can you had to buy from a company it later turned out her brother-in-law owned. The price was double what you'd pay at a hardware store. A few people complained. They were hit with fines for disrupting the peace. Then came the landscaping rules. All flowers had to be white or yellow. All bushes had to be trimmed into perfect spheres. No vegetable gardens in the front yard. Clara's prize-winning tomatoes had to go. Each new rule was a little tighter, a little more absurd. She had a small group of followers, people who liked the power or were too scared to speak up. They became her eyes and ears, reporting every tiny infraction. Our comic relief neighbor, Sal, a retired guy from New York who was obsessed with his perfectly manicured lawn, got a fine because one of his garden gnomes was an inch too tall. An inch? He'd rant to me over the fence. Can you believe this woman, Ethan? An inch. What's she doing? Walking around with a tape measure. It's un-American, that's what it is. My gnome, Ferdinand, fought in the garden wars. He has rights. I tried to stay out of it. I told myself it was just small-town politics. I had seen real conflict, and this wasn't it. But it kept getting worse. People started moving away. The houses they sold were bought up quickly, always by the same holding company with a weird, generic name. Brenda would smile her fake smile at the HOA meetings and talk about maintaining property values. But the neighborhood was losing its heart. It was becoming a sterile, joyless place where everyone was afraid of getting a nasty letter slipped under their door. My hot-headed nature wanted to scream at her in those meetings, to call her out for the petty dictator she was. But Clara, my smart, calculated Clara, always held me back. Not yet, she'd say. Yelling won't work. She wants you to yell. It makes you look unstable. We need a plan. We need to be smarter. She was right, of course. She always was. I learned to bite my tongue, to watch and wait. I documented everything, every ridiculous rule, every unfair fine. I started a file. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but my training taught me one thing. Gather intelligence before you act. The first time she mentioned the bridge, it was subtle. At an HOA meeting, she talked about modernizing our community's entrance. She said the old bridge was charming, but structurally unsound. I knew that was a lie. I had personally inspected that bridge. My great-grandfather had built it to last forever. The stones were solid. The mortar was strong. It was safer than the new deck sheet had built on the community clubhouse, which already had a wobble. A few weeks later, a so-called independent engineer she hired produced a report. It was full of big words and scary diagrams, all saying the bridge was a danger and needed to be replaced. I knew the engineer was in her pocket. Everyone did. But no one knew how to fight it. She controlled the board. She controlled the bank account. And she controlled the narrative. She started talking about a luxury lakefront resort that would bring jobs and prestige to our community. An artist's rendering appeared in the newsletter. It was a giant glass and steel monstrosity that looked completely out of place. And its grand entrance was right where the coal bridge stood. That's when I knew this wasn't just about control anymore. This was about money. Big money. And she was willing to bulldoze my family's history to get it. I stood up in that meeting. I didn't yell. I spoke calmly. I talked about the history of the bridge, about what it meant to the founding families. I offered to pay for my own, truly independent structural engineer to inspect it. Brenda just smiled that cold, dead smile. The board has already voted. Ethan, she said. The decision is final. We appreciate your passion. It was a dismissal, a slap in the face. She was telling me, and everyone else in that room, that our history didn't matter. Our voices didn't matter. Only her vision, her resort, her money mattered. Walking out of that meeting with Clara's hand in mine, I felt a familiar fire ignite in my gut. It was the same fire I'd felt on missions when the plan went wrong and everything was on the line. Clara saw it in my eyes. Okay, she said softly, squeezing my hand. Now we make a plan. The peace I had come here for was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Brenda Montgomery had pushed and pushed. She was about to find out what happened when she pushed someone who knew how to push back. She thought this was a battle of HOA rules and regulations. She had no idea I was about to change the battlefield entirely, and that her big, fancy resort was resting on a foundation far more unstable than she could ever imagine. The official notice was a single sheet of cheap paper stuck to our door with a piece of tape. It was printed in a fancy, flowing fontan absurd choice for such an ugly message. It announced a community improvement project starting in 48 hours. The project was the removal of the obsolete avenue structure. They didn't even have the guts to call it a bridge. My hands were shaking as I ripped it from the door, not with fear, but with pure, unfiltered rage. 48 hours. She was giving us 2 days. It was a power move designed to prevent any organized opposition. That which? I muttered, crumpling the paper in my fist. Kaiser, sensing my anger, came over and nudged my hand with his wet nose, whining softly. Clara took the crumpled ball of paper from me and smoothed it out on the kitchen table. She read it, her expression hardening. This isn't a notice, she said, her voice quiet but firm. This is a declaration of war. She was right. There was an emergency HOA meeting called for that night. We knew it was just for show, a way for Brenda to pretend she was following the rules. The whole neighborhood showed up. The small community clubhouse was packed. People were angry, confused, and scared. Neighbor Sal was there, wearing a Save the Gnomes t-shirt he'd had custom printed. He grabbed my arm as I walked in. Ethan, this is nuts. First Ferdinand, now the bridge. What's next? The lake? Is she going to drain the whole lake? His words, meant as a joke, sent a strange shiver down my spine. The meeting was a disaster, just as we expected. Brenda stood at the front, flanked by 2 large men who were definitely not from our neighborhood. They were her muscle, there to intimidate anyone who got too loud. She gave a slick presentation full of lies and half-truths. She talked about safety, about progress, about the wonderful economic benefits of her resort. She showed the fake engineering report and the bogus permit. When people tried to ask questions, she would cut them off. That's not relevant. We're moving on. The decision has been made. I watched her, my anger boiling. This wasn't a meeting, it was a coronation. She was a queen ruling over subjects, not a president serving her community. I had a whole speech prepared. I had facts. I had history. I had my great-grandfather's journal where he wrote about building the bridge. I waited for my turn to speak, but she never called on me. She looked right past me, ignoring my raised hand. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up. You're a liar, Brenda, I said, my voice cutting through the room. A hush fell over the crowd. That bridge is solid, and you know it. This is about greed. You're destroying our town's history for your own personal profit. Her face turned a blotchy red. The mask of calm composure slipped. You are out of order, Ethan, she shrieked. This is a private meeting for residents in good standing. I am in good standing, I shot back. And I'm a resident whose family history you're about to turn into a pile of dirt. The 2 big guys started walking toward me. Sit down, Brenda screamed, or I'll have you removed. That was it. The hothead in me took over. You and what army? I said, taking a step into the aisle. Clara was pulling on my shirt, whispering, Ethan, no. This is what she wants. Don't do it. But it was too late. The goons grabbed my arms. I could have thrown them off easily. A part of me, A very big part of me wanted to. But I saw the look in Clara's eyes. It wasn't fear. It was a plea to be smart, to stick to the real plan. I let them push me toward the door. The whole room was in an uproar. People were shouting. Sal was yelling something about tyranny and gnomes. As they shoved me out into the cool night air, I looked back at Brenda. She was smiling again. That smug, triumphant smirk. She had won. She had baited me, and I had taken it. She had made me look like the unreasonable one, the hothead who couldn't control his temper. They had ejected me from the meeting, but Clara stayed inside. That was our plan. If one of us got kicked out, the other would stay and observe. She was my eyes and ears now. I stood outside, listening to the muffled sounds of Brenda shutting down the rest of the opposition. I had lost the battle, but this was just one small skirmish. As I walked home with Kaiser trotting silently beside me, the anger began to cool, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Open confrontation was useless. Public appeals were pointless. Brenda had insulated herself with rules, with money, and with fear. You couldn't fight a monster like that by playing her game. You had to change the game entirely. You had to find her weakness, the one thing she wasn't protecting, and hit her there with everything you had. When Clara came home an hour later, her face was grim. "It's done," she said. "The demolition is scheduled for sunrise tomorrow." The finality of her words hung in the air. We had less than 12 hours. The bridge was going to die in the morning. But as I looked at my wife, my partner, the strategist who balanced my fire with her ice, I knew something else. So was Brenda's reign. She just didn't know it yet. The war was on, and we were about to open a new front she never saw coming. The morning air was still and heavy. Sunrise was a pale pink smear on the horizon, but the peace was shattered by the roar of the bulldozer. We didn't go down to watch. We couldn't. We stood on our porch, Clara and I, her hand in mine, and we listened. We heard the sickening crunch of metal against stone, the groan of the old bridge as it gave way. The final, thunderous crash as a century of history was reduced to rubble. Each sound was a punch to the gut. Kaiser whined beside me, his ears flat against his head. Even he knew something terrible was happening. When the noise stopped, a grim silence fell over the neighborhood. It was the silence of defeat. Brenda had won. She had done the unthinkable, and no one had been able to stop her. The anger inside me was a white-hot inferno. I wanted to break something. I wanted to march down there and confront her, to make her pay. But Clara's grip on my hand was a lifeline to sanity. "Not yet, Ethan," she said, her voice a low whisper. "Rage is a tool. Don't waste it. Let's use it." She led me into the house, into the dusty attic I rarely visited. In the corner, under a white sheet, was an old wooden and leather trunk. It had belonged to my great-grandfather, Elijah Cole. "Your father gave this to us when we moved in," Clara said, pulling off the sheet. "He said it was full of old junk, but that you should have it." I had never opened it. I wasn't much for old things, besides the bridge. But now that bridge was gone. This trunk was all I had left of Elijah. I knelt and lifted the heavy lid. The smell of old paper and cedar filled the air. Inside were stacks of yellowed documents, leather-bound ledgers, and faded photographs. For hours, we sat on the attic floor, sifting through the past. We found his journals, filled with his elegant, looping handwriting. We found the original plans for the bridge, drawn on brittle, cracking paper. And then, at the very bottom, tucked inside a thick leather folder, we found it. It wasn't much to look at. A single piece of vellum, folded in four. The writing was dense and legalistic, but the heading was clear: Deed of Trust and Water Control Covenant for Lake Norwood Dam. My heart started to pound. I read the document aloud, my voice shaky. It was a legal agreement from 1923, a year before the bridge was built. The town founders had formed a pact. My great-grandfather, Elijah Cole, had agreed to build and maintain the dam that created Lake Norwood. In exchange for his labor and materials, the deed granted him, and his direct bloodline, sole and perpetual control of the dam's primary release valve, the valve that controlled the water level of the entire lake. It was all there in black and white, signed by the founding fathers and stamped with the county seal. It was ironclad, unbreakable. I looked at Clara, my eyes wide. "She controls the HOA," I said, a slow, devious smile spreading across my face. "But I control the lake." Clara's eyes lit up with a fire that matched my own. "This is it. This is the weapon. This is the game changer." "She thinks her power comes from that clipboard," Clara said, tapping the ancient deed. "But the real power has been sitting in our attic all along." Now my methodical side took over. The hot-headed soldier was gone. replaced by the cool, calculating strategist. We had the weapon, but we needed intelligence. We needed to know exactly where to aim it. We spent the next 2 days in a blur of activity. Clara, who was a genius with research, started digging into Brenda's finances. She used public records, business filings, anything she could find online. I started making quiet phone calls to old army buddies, guys who owed me favors, guys who knew how to find information that wasn't public. We started with the holding company that was buying up all the properties. It was a shell corporation, of course, but it had to be registered somewhere. Clara found it. It was registered to an address that turned out to be a mailbox in another state, but the registered agent, the name on the paperwork, was Brenda's maiden name. A sloppy mistake. From there, the dominoes began to fall. We unraveled a whole network of shell companies, all linked to Brenda, her husband, and her brother-in-law. We saw how she was using HOA funds for landscaping and maintenance contracts, paying exorbitant amounts to companies she secretly owned. She was laundering the neighborhood's money and using it to fund her resort project. It was bigger and dirtier than I had ever imagined. My part of the plan was to find the money on the other end, who was funding the resort. A project this big needed a major loan. My contact came through. He gave me the name of the bank, a big out-of-state investment firm. He also gave me the name of the loan officer. Now we had a target. Clara spent a whole night digging into the bank's commercial lending practices. She found their standard loan agreements. And buried deep in the fine print, she found the clause that would be Brenda's undoing. It was a standard clause for properties that depended on a natural feature like a lake. It said that if the primary amenity, in this case, Lake Norwood, was significantly diminished for a period of more than 72 hours, the lender had the right to freeze all funds and call the entire loan due immediately. Significantly diminished, Clara read, her voice trembling with excitement. The contract defines that as a water level drop of 18 inches or more. I looked at the ancient deed in my hand. I looked at the financial records spread across our dining room table. I looked at my wife, my brilliant, resilient partner. Brenda had built her empire of corruption on a foundation of lies and intimidation. But that whole empire was built on the edge of a lake. My lake. She thought she had taken something from me when she destroyed that bridge. She had no idea that in doing so, she had given me the key to her own destruction. All I had to do was turn it. We had the plan. It was simple. It was brutal. And it was beautiful. But as the initial thrill of discovery wore off, a new, heavier feeling began to set in. We were about to do something drastic. Draining the lake, even partially, would have consequences. It wasn't just about Brenda. It was about everyone. The next night, Clara and I sat on our porch, watching the moon rise over the water, the same water we were planning to unleash. Kaiser lay at my feet, his head on his paws, blissfully unaware of the chaos we were about to cause. What about the fish? Clara asked quietly. The birds that nest by the shore? The neighbors' docks that will be sitting in the mud? Her questions hung in the air, heavy and real. This was the part of the operation they don't talk about in the movies, the collateral damage. What about the people who love this lake just as much as we do? She continued, her voice filled with genuine concern. She wasn't questioning the plan. She was making sure we understood the cost. This was why she was my perfect partner. She was the conscience that kept my fiery nature from burning everything down, including ourselves. She forced me to ask the hard question. Where is the line between law and revenge? Was this justice? Or were we becoming just as ruthless as Brenda? She tore down a piece of history, Clara. I said, my voice low. She's stealing from our neighbors. She's driving people from their homes. She's a cancer on this community. Sometimes the only way to get rid of a cancer is with harsh treatment. It's going to hurt. It's going to be ugly. But if we don't cut it out, it will kill this place. I believed it, every word, but it didn't make the decision any easier. We were about to use a weapon of mass disruption. Was it a proportional response? Then I thought about Brenda's smug face as the bridge came down. I thought about the fear in my neighbor's eyes at the meeting. I thought about Sal and his ridiculous, heartfelt battle for his garden gnome. Brenda was a bully who only respected overwhelming force. Pleading with her was useless. Reporting her to the authorities she had in her pocket was a waste of time. To beat her, we had to hit her where she lived, her wallet. We had to dismantle the source of her power. And that source was the resort, funded by the loan, which was secured by the lake. My lake. Just then, we saw a flashlight beam bobbing along the shoreline. It was neighbor Sal, out for his nightly constitutional. He saw us on the porch and wandered over to the fence line. Hey, Ethan. Clara, he said, his voice a loud whisper. Terrible business with the bridge. Just terrible. That woman is a menace. A menace. I was just checking my sprinkler pump. You know, it pulls from the lake. Gotta make sure the intake is clear. Can't have my fescue getting thirsty. It's a very sensitive grass, you know. He went on for another 5 minutes about fertilizer schedules and soil acidity. It was his usual comic relief, but tonight it was a stark reminder of the real-world impact of our plan. Sal's precious lawn was about to get very, very thirsty. When he finally said goodnight and wandered off, Clara turned to me. His sprinklers won't work, she said softly. People's boats will be stuck. It's going to be a mess. I know, I said, but Sal will get over his lawn. The boats can be moved. The mess can be cleaned up. But if Brenda builds that resort, the damage she does will be permanent. I stood up. The debate was over. The decision was made. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is hot and angry. This was cold. This was methodical. This was justice. But as I looked out at the peaceful, moonlit water, a new thought crept into my mind, a sliver of ice in the heat of my resolve. We had found Brenda's dirty secret, the shell companies, the laundered money. It was a powerful motive for everything she'd done. But what if it wasn't the whole story? We had assumed the properties she was buying up through the shell company were for the resort's expansion. But when we mapped them out, the pattern was strange. They weren't all connected. They formed a weird, jagged buffer zone around the proposed resort land. It didn't make sense. Why buy those specific houses and not others? It felt like a piece of the puzzle was missing. It was a loose thread, a question I couldn't answer. For a moment, I hesitated. Should we wait? Try to figure out this new wrinkle? No. We had to act now. The loan was active. The construction crews were starting to prep the site. We had to hit the kill switch before she could secure her position any further. I pushed the doubt aside. Whatever her full plan was, cutting off her money would stop it dead. The missing piece would have to wait. I had a date with a very old, very important iron wheel. The time for moral debate was over. The time for action was now. The line between justice and revenge felt razor thin, and I was about to step right over it. Midnight. The air was thick and silent, broken only by the chirping of crickets. I moved through the woods that bordered the lake like a ghost, Kaiser at my heels. He didn't make a sound, a perfect shadow in the darkness. My military training had never fully left me. I still knew how to be invisible. Clara stayed at the house, our command center. She had a scanner monitoring local emergency frequencies and a direct line to me via a burner phone. We were treating this like a mission because it was. The dam wasn't a huge concrete wall like you see in movies. It was an old earthen dam, built into the landscape, covered with grass and trees. It was the heart of the lake, and its secrets were known only to my family. I found the spot easily, a small, overgrown clearing marked by a single large oak tree. Hidden under a thick blanket of moss and roots was a heavy iron trapdoor. It hadn't been opened in decades. It took a crowbar and all my strength to pry it open with a deafening screech of rusted metal. Below was a dark, narrow shaft with an iron ladder leading down into the earth. The air that rose up smelled of damp stone and stale water. This was it, the point of no return. I clipped a small flashlight to my shirt, gave Kaiser a final pat on the head stay, watch, and began to climb down. The ladder was cold and slick. It led down about 20 feet to a small, circular chamber made of cut stone. It was like being inside a well. In the center of the chamber was the mechanism, a giant cast iron wheel about 4 feet across, mounted on a massive screw that disappeared into the floor. This was the release valve. The handle was a simple iron bar, rusted but solid. I put my hands on it. It was ice cold. According to my great-grandfather's journal, 3 full turns to the left would lower the lake level by approximately 2 feet. Enough to trigger the clause in Brenda's loan. Enough to cause chaos. I took a deep breath and pushed. Nothing. The wheel was frozen in time. I repositioned my feet, gritted my teeth, and threw my entire body weight into it. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, the wheel began to move. The sound of metal grinding against metal was horrific. It screamed in the small chamber, echoing off the stone walls. Inch by painful inch, I forced it to turn. My muscles screamed in protest. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. Then I heard a new sound, a low rumble from deep within the dam. The rumbling grew into a roar, the sound of 1,000 waterfalls unleashed. A torrent of water began to pour out of a discharge pipe on the far side of the dam, hidden in the creek bed, a place no one ever looked. The plan was working. I finished the first rotation, my arms burning. Then the second. The roar of the water was deafening now. I could feel the vibration through the stone floor. One more to go. I gave it one last, massive heave. The wheel completed its third rotation. I had done it. I climbed back up the ladder, my body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. Kaiser was waiting right where I left him, his tail giving a single, slow wag. We made our way back through the woods, leaving the roaring dam behind us. I didn't sleep that night. Clara and I sat by the window, watching the lake. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the water began to recede. The shoreline grew wider. A rock that had been submerged for years poked its head above the surface. By dawn, the transformation was shocking. The water had pulled back by 50 feet. Docks that were once floating were now perched awkwardly on stilts in the mud. Boats listed to one side, their keels buried in the muck. I filmed a time-stamped drone shot every 6 hours, the ruler post I'd hammered in showing the water creeping down inch by inch. The air was filled with a thick, fishy smell. The chaos began around 7 a.m. The first to notice were the early morning fishermen, whose boats were now high and dry. Then came the phone calls, the confused voices, the rising panic. People came out of their houses, staring in disbelief at the shrunken lake. Neighbor Sal was having a full-blown meltdown on his front lawn, staring at his now useless sprinkler pump like it was a dead relative. And then a sleek black SUV came tearing down the street and screeched to a halt near the ruined bridge. Brenda Montgomery got out. Her face, usually a mask of smug control, was a twisted mess of fury and disbelief. Her daughter Tiffany stumbled out after her, phone in hand, looking like she was about to be sick. "What is this? What happened?" Brenda screamed at no one in particular. Her eyes scanned the muddy shoreline, the stranded boats, the general disaster. And then her eyes found me. I was standing on my porch, drinking a cup of coffee, just watching. Our eyes locked across the newly created mudflat. There was no need for words. She knew. Somehow, she knew this was my doing. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on the new dry land. "You!" she finally shrieked, her voice echoing across the silent morning. "You did this. I will destroy you. I will ruin you. This isn't over." Her threat was raw, filled with hate. But I wasn't scared. I just took a slow sip of my coffee. She was right about one thing. It wasn't over. But she was a queen whose castle was now made of mud. And I had a feeling her very bad day was just getting started. I expected Brenda to panic. I expected her to lash out, to make threats, to file lawsuits. I was prepared for all of that. What I wasn't prepared for was for her to fight back with a move that was as devious and brilliant as it was evil. My plan was simple. Drain the lake, trigger the loan clause, bankrupt her project. Her counter-move threatened to turn my own weapon against me and destroy me in the process. 2 days after Drain Day, as Sal had started calling it, a fleet of official-looking vehicles descended on our neighborhood. A county sheriff's car, a public works truck, and a shiny sedan carrying a man in an expensive suit. And leading the parade, looking smugger than ever, was Brenda. She marched right up to the dam, the piece of land my family had controlled for a centurias if she owned it. I went out to meet them, my heart pounding a steady, angry rhythm. Clara was on the phone, her fingers flying across her keyboard, trying to figure out what was happening. "What is the meaning of this, Brenda?" I demanded, planting myself in her path. Kaiser stood beside me, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Brenda just smiled, that ice-cold smile. "Public safety, Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "It appears our community has a much bigger problem than a low water level. We have a dangerously unstable dam." She held up a document. It was another official report, this one stamped with the county seal. It was from a well-known engineering firm, and it claimed that the dam itself was structurally unsound, at imminent risk of catastrophic failure. It recommended that the county declare a state of emergency, seize control of the dam immediately, and begin emergency repairs. The repairs, of course, would involve refilling the lake to stabilize the structure. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but it was a masterful one. I had used an old deed to drain the lake. She was using a modern, fear-mongering tactic to take the dam away from me entirely. She had turned my act of aggression into a public safety crisis, painting me as the reckless fool who had endangered everyone. The man in the suit stepped forward. He introduced himself as a county councilman. He didn't look me in the eye. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice flat. "Given the severity of this report, the county is issuing a temporary injunction. This area is now under the control of the Public Works Department for emergency assessment and stabilization. He handed me a piece of paper, an official court order. Just like that, I was a trespasser on my own family's land. You can't do this, I yelled, the hot-headed soldier roaring back to life. This is my property. That report is a fraud. The councilman just shrugged. The report is from a licensed engineering firm. We have to take it seriously. We can sort out the property disputes later. Right now, our priority is preventing a disaster. Brenda was practically glowing with triumph. She had outmaneuvered me. While I was focused on her loan, she had gone around me, using her political connections to create a crisis that superseded my property rights. She would get her lake back, her loan would be safe, and I would be buried under a mountain of legal trouble for causing a public panic. It was a brilliant, ruthless move. I had to admit, I was almost impressed. Her hired goons from the bridge demolition were back, now wearing bright yellow safety vests, and they started stringing up yellow danger tape around the perimeter of the dam. One of them smirked at me as he hammered a post into the ground. Looks like you're out of luck, pal, he grunted. I stood there, clutching the injunction, completely stunned. It felt like a checkmate. I had made my big move, drained the queen's power, and she had responded by simply knocking my king off the board. Clara came running up, her face pale. I checked the engineering firm's website, she whispered frantically. They're legitimate, very respected. I don't understand how she did this. I looked over at Brenda, who was now directing the public works crew with an air of authority, pointing and gesturing. She looked like a general commanding her troops on a victorious battlefield. She had turned my secret weapon into a public liability. She had taken my strength, the dam, and made it my greatest weakness. By noon the next day, the county engineer reviewed the real blueprints, complete with photographs of the still intact spillway, and withdrew the emergency order. The unsafe dam tape came down faster than Brenda's smile. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt a flicker of doubt, a cold knot of fear. Had I pushed too far? Had my plan backfired so spectacularly that it was going to destroy us instead of her? Brenda caught my eye and gave me a slow, deliberate wink. It was a gesture of pure dominance, a silent message that said, "You thought you were smart, but I'm smarter. You're finished." As her crew started unloading equipment to fix the dam and refill the lake, I knew we were out of time. She had me cornered. My one great weapon was gone. I had to find a new one, and I had to find it fast, before she erased her mistake and buried me with it forever. The injunction gave Brenda control for 72 hours. 3 days. That's how long we had before they started pumping water back into the lake, erasing all my leverage and cementing her victory. Defeat was not an option. Losing was not in my vocabulary. That night, our house became a war room. The anger and fear were gone, replaced by a cold, hard focus. This was the final push. Clara was at her computer, a whirlwind of clicks and keystrokes. I was on the phone, calling in every favor I was ever owed. The twist Brenda had thrown at us was good, but it had a flaw. It was a lie. And lies, no matter how well constructed, have cracks. We just had to find them. Our first break came around 2 a.m. Clara, my brilliant, methodical Clara, found it. The engineering report, she said, her voice electric. She didn't just get a friendly engineer to write it. She forged it. She pointed to the screen. She had pulled up the official report from the county website. Then she pulled up a dozen other reports from the same engineering firm. Look at the signature, she said. The one on her report is close, but it's not perfect. The loop on the G is different. It was a tiny detail, something no one would ever notice unless they were looking for it. It wasn't enough to prove anything on its own, but it was a start. It was a crack. So, I made a call. A friend of mine from the service works in corporate security. He's a wizard at finding people. I gave him the name of the senior engineer whose signature was on that report. An hour later, my friend called back. Got him, he said. He's on vacation with his family in Hawaii. A FaceTime call to the real engineer, sunburned in a Hawaiian shirt, confirmed he'd never set foot in our county. His office confirmed he hadn't signed off on any field reports in 2 weeks. Bingo. Brenda hadn't just gotten a fake report. She had forged the signature of a real engineer, gambling that no one would bother to check. We now had her on fraud. But we needed more. We needed to blow her entire operation apart in one undeniable shot. The next piece of the puzzle was the shell company, the one registered in her maiden name. Clara had been digging into its other filings. She found the original incorporation documents. This is interesting, she said, leaning close to her monitor. the person listed as the company's treasurer. The signature doesn't match any of Brenda's known associates. The name is Eleanor Hayes. A quick search revealed that Eleanor Hayes was an elderly woman who had lived in our neighborhood years ago. She had passed away 2 years before the company was even formed. Brenda hadn't just used a fake name. She had stolen the identity of a dead woman to hide her crimes. It was a new level of deplorable, even for her. We had to find Eleanor Hayes' family. It was a long shot, but we had to try. After hours of searching online obituaries and public records, Clara found a surviving son. He lived 3 states away. It was 4 in the morning, but I made the call. I explained who I was, what was happening. At first, he was suspicious, but when I mentioned the shell company and his mother's name, there was a long silence on the line. My mother, he said, his voice thick with emotion, was a meticulous woman. After she died, we found out her identity had been stolen. Her accounts were drained. We never found out who did it. We had found another victim who could prove Brenda wasn't just a corrupt HOA president, but a common thief. The day of the emergency HOA meeting arrived. This was the showdown. The meeting was called by Brenda, of course. It was meant to be her victory lap, where she would explain the damn crisis and praise her own swift action. The community clubhouse was buzzing with tension and fear. She stood at the podium, basking in the spotlight, oozing fake sincerity and concern. My fellow residents, she began. As you know, we are facing a grave public safety emergency. I let her talk. I let her dig her own grave. Clara was at home, coordinating our final move. I had a small projector set up, linked to my laptop. I had alerted the county sheriff, not the local guys who were friendly with Brenda, but a detective from the white-collar crime division. I told him I had evidence of fraud and identity theft, and that I would be presenting it publicly. He was intrigued enough to agree to be in the area. As Brenda droned on about water pressure and structural integrity, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara. He's on, and the sheriff is outside. That was the signal. I stood up. Excuse me, Brenda, I said, my voice calm and clear. I believe you have a few things wrong. All eyes turned to me. Brenda's face darkened. You are out of order, Ethan. This is about the dam. You're right, I said, walking to the front of the room. This is about the dam. And about this. I clicked a button on my laptop. The projector flared to life, displaying the ancient deed to the dam on the screen behind her. The crowd gasped. This document gives my family sole control of the dam's valve, I explained. I lowered the water level, not recklessly, but precisely. 18 inches. Just enough to trigger a clause in the loan for your resort. I clicked again. The screen now showed the flowchart of her shell companies, the money flowing from the HOA accounts into her pockets. Murmurs rippled through the room. Brenda was sputtering, calling for her goons, but they were hesitating, watching the screen. And about that emergency report, I continued, my voice getting louder, stronger. I displayed the 2 signatures side by side, the real one and the forgery. This is the signature of the real engineer, and this is the forgery you submitted to the county. The crowd was on its feet now, shouting. Brenda was ashen-faced, cornered. And finally, I said, my voice dropping for dramatic effect, you founded your company using a treasurer named Eleanor Hayes. I clicked one last time. The face of a kind-looking, elderly man appeared on the screen via a live video call. Mr. Hayes, I said, could you please tell the residents of Lake Norwood who your mother was? He spoke, his voice filled with a quiet dignity and pain, telling the story of his mother's stolen identity. The room fell silent, listening to his every word. As he finished, the back doors of the clubhouse opened. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies walked in, the detective I had spoken to right behind them. Forgery plus identity theft met the state's 2-strike fraud rule enough for immediate cuffs. They walked past the stunned crowd, right up to the podium. Brenda Montgomery, the detective said, his voice booming in the silent room. You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. The room erupted. People were cheering, crying, hugging each other. Sal was standing on a chair, yelling, "Justice for Ferdinand." Kaiser let out one satisfied woof. Even he knew the Pax Alpha had just changed. It was pure, beautiful chaos. As the deputies put her in handcuffs, Brenda locked eyes with me one last time. Her face was no longer smug or powerful. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "This isn't over," she screamed as they led her away. A pathetic, empty threat from a queen who had just lost her kingdom. I looked at the faces of my neighbors, the joy, the relief. It was finally over. We had won. It wasn't an exact copy of the old one, but it was a tribute. Built with the same local stone by a team of local masons, it followed my great-grandfather's design. A bronze plaque was set into one of the pillars. It read, "Cole Crossing, rebuilt by the community." Brenda's resort project had imploded the moment her loan was frozen. Once fraud fouls a title, no bank touches it. Her land was radioactive on every underwriting screen. The investigation had uncovered years of corruption. She was facing a mountain of charges, and most of her cronies had turned on her to save themselves. Her entitled daughter had moved away with her father, leaving behind a trail of unpaid debts. The holding company's properties, including the land for the resort, were seized and sold off, with the proceeds going to repay the HOA and the victims of her scams, like Eleanor Hayes's family. The Attorney General froze every parcel tied to her shell network under RICO forfeiture. We used some of that money to rebuild the bridge. Clara came and stood beside me, slipping her arm around my waist. She looked out at the crowd, at our neighbors, who were no longer afraid, no longer living under the thumb of a petty tyrant. "Look what you did," she said softly. "No," I corrected her, pulling her close. "Look what we did." She smiled, and we stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. Neighbor Sal was manning the grill, arguing with someone about the proper way to cook a hot dog. "You gotta boil him first. It's the only way. Otherwise, you're just eating grilled disappointment." Life was back to normal, better than normal. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of community we hadn't had before. We had been tested, and we had come out stronger. We called the celebration Drain Day, a tongue-in-cheek reminder of how it all went down. It was a day to celebrate not just the return of our lake, but the reclaiming of our home. That old question, the one that had haunted me in the dead of night, where is the line between law and revenge? The answer seemed so clear now. The line is drawn by your purpose. Revenge is about causing pain. Justice is about restoring balance. We hadn't set out to destroy Brenda Montgomery. We had set out to protect our home, our history, and our neighbors. Her destruction was just a consequence of her own actions. You can't build an empire on a foundation of lies and expect it to stand. Sooner or later, someone will come along and kick out the first stone, and the whole rotten thing will come crashing down. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the new bridge, I knew we had found our peace again. But this time, it was a peace we had fought for, a peace we had earned. And that, I realized, was the only kind of peace that truly lasts.